We can come here for a good presentation. This is the dissertation defense and third exam for Julie Viollaz, who's been working hard on this for many years. Her committee is, I'm the only one at John Jay on her committee. It's a committee of outsiders. Jim Lynch, a former faculty member, joins us from University of Maryland. We're very pleased he could be here. Ron Clark of Rutgers University is also on her committee, is a very well-known wildlife crime researcher, is unable to attend today. He's suffering some ill health and was just not able to make the trip into New York. I have some notes from him that I'll read at an appropriate point. I've seen Julie's presentation, and it's very interesting. It's colorful, thoroughly illustrated, and I think you'll find it very informative. And she'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions from the committee. There will be time for questions from other people as well. And I also want to introduce Shayla Delgado. I don't know if you all know her. Shayla is recording this dissertation defense. She did it for a couple other people as well. It will be posted in some appropriate place. And Julie will eventually be able to see it herself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie.
Cool. Where do I click this? Just right here. Good. Good to go? Okay. Well, the first thing I want to do is thank all of you for being here. It's been a long process, and I think if you're sitting in this room, actually, you've been part of the process in one way or another, either through your moral support, financial support, through your research that has inspired me at some point or another. So just thank you. And there's actually one other person that I do specifically want to thank, is a woman named Lucy, who was actually part of the janitorial staff at John Jay when I first started my PhD. And she used to kick me out of the conference room every night, telling me, you need to go home, you need to stop working so hard. She actually taught me some of the most important lessons about work-life balance, and I just kind of want to recognize her. She actually died 4 days before I handed in my full dissertation, but she was a huge influence. So let's get on to the subject. So I'll start with just a brief kind of introduction to human-wildlife conflict and human-leopard conflict, then kind of talk about my theoretical framework, the research questions that I've kind of driven this research. I've done an overview of the data and the analysis that I run, the findings, and then talk a little bit about what I call the human-leopard conflict toolkit, which comes from discussion of my dissertation, and then move on to contributions to theory and practice. So there are a number of motivations for illegally killing leopards. The first is trophy hunting, then there's the pelt trade, the pet trade, bushmeat hunting, the traditional medicine trade. So those 5 are actually what I would consider being minor threats. Minor because they either only occur in a small geographical area or they affect a small number of leopards. And for example, the pelt trade actually affects a large number of leopards generally, but what I mean when I say it's a minor threat is that right now there's a lot of nonprofits working on market reduction strategies and ways to reduce the trade. So I would consider it to be minor because things are looking up right now. The one motivation that's not actually looking up in terms of getting fixed is human-wildlife conflict. That's actually increasing right now. What you're seeing is with the population increases in the world right now, and also the development of a lot of rural land, you're seeing more human-wildlife conflict happening. And so for leopards, that means leopard attacking livestock, leopards attacking humans, causing damage to property, and that's increasing right now, and it's likely to continue to increase. So there's a lot of factors that actually contribute to human-wildlife conflict and human-leopard conflict. Human factors are human behaviors that cause increased contact between leopards and humans. Ecological factors are aspects of leopard behavior that bring them into closer contact with humans and therefore result in more conflicts. So human factors include things like habitat destruction, economic strain that livestock farmers feel when they lose livestock to leopards, the belief that predation should not occur, which is actually fairly common among a lot of the farmers that I talk to, that they will expect losses from for example, tick fever or illness, but they would never expect losses from leopards or accept them. Oh, and ecological factors. So the large home ranges of carnivores actually, causes them to come into contact with humans more often because their area where they actually roam is so large that they will at some point overlap with human settlement. You've got their opportunistic hunting behavior, which means that if they have the choice between wild prey and livestock, they will go for livestock. It's so much easier. Livestock, when they get scared, tend to congregate in a group, which makes it very easy to pick off 1, 2, 3, 7, however many you want. And that's what surplus killing is. It almost never happens in the wild because wild animals run and they hardly ever get caught unless they're usually ill, diseased, or bad luck. But with surplus killing, farmers are so angry because they feel like the leopard has wasted resources, and that really drives them nuts. So when I talk about illegal leopard killings, I mean two things essentially. Poaching, which is usually killing a leopard for profit, and I mean retaliatory killings. So killings in retaliation for some sort of human-wildlife conflict, for livestock losses, for human attacks. And we focus a lot on poaching because there's a White House kind of task force on it right now. It's the big thing, throwing as many law enforcement resources towards dealing with poaching. But the reality is that retaliatory killings are actually probably going to be one of the major issues with poaching when it comes to conserving leopards in the future. And so I think there's actually a way of handling both the poaching and the retaliatory killing problem by thinking about what comes before these killings. So what comes before these killings is usually some sort of tolerance for leopard killing, the idea that it's okay at some point to kill a leopard. And a lot of times that results because of human-wildlife conflict. People are fed up with the idea of having leopards, cause them costs and hurt. And so they develop a tolerance for leopard killing where maybe they're not going to kill a leopard themselves, but they're going to be okay with the idea that somebody's going to kill it on their land. So you develop this tolerance for leopard killing, which leads to nobody willing to be an informal guardian for leopards. This idea that, non-law enforcement personnel can play a role in preventing killings. Well, nobody wants to be that person, because to be that person, there has to be a certain number of things. You have to be available, so you have to be in the area. You have to have knowledge of the area to understand when a killing is about to take place, but you also have to be willing to intervene. And when you are resentful of wildlife and you have a tolerance for leopard killing, that third criteria is not going to be met. So my theoretical framework is environmental criminology. I'll just give you a few principles so that you understand the logic. So people are situated decision makers. So the idea that when someone decides to commit a crime, they weigh the cost and benefit. They make a reasoned decision, a decision that can be bounded by what they understand about the situation, but it's a reasoned decision. And you can actually influence whether or not somebody commits a crime by changing the situational context in which the crime is going to take place. So you can influence that decision by changing the context. And situational determinants are those characteristics that make a crime possible at a particular place and time. So if you understand what those situational determinants are, you can actually try and modify them to prevent, for example, retaliatory leopard killings. So situational crime prevention is a framework that you can use to come up with solutions to kind of prevent crime before it happens. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later. So in my research, I have two types of situational determinants. I have environmental determinants and human determinants. So human determinants are things like expectations from wildlife, whether or not people know about environmental issues and are sensitive to them. Local history, is there a history of what we call fortress conservation in the area, where people are literally, shunted out of areas so that we can conserve them without any concern for, do these people want to leave this area? Are we, making people homeless? And also the relationship between local actors, whether they're willing to work together. Environmental determinants are things like land use overlap, whether or not, leopard territory overlaps with human settlement, leopard abundance, how many leopards you have in an area, and poor leopard habitat. So for example, if a habitat is not suitable for leopards and you introduce livestock into that habitat, you don't have enough wild prey to actually sustain your leopard population, but there you just put nice piece of meat on the market for the leopards. So, you're gonna expect some issues. So 3 questions drive this research. The first is, what is the scope and nature of retaliatory leopard killing in the study areas? The second is, what is the scope and nature of leopard attacks on humans, which is a bit of a sub-question to the first. And the last is, what spatial factors contribute to retaliatory leopard killings? So there's 4 analyses in this research. It was not because I'm a glutton for punishment. It was because leopard data, retaliatory leopard killing data is so scarce. Any really sort of data on wildlife crime is so scarce that you do what you can with what you have. So the idea was that if I could replicate my results across 4 different analyses, that at least it would give me something, some general findings to bring to the table, that even though the strength of one individual data set may not have been strong, I could still come up with good results that would be useful for research. And I'll go over each analysis individually, but the first 3 actually deal with human determinants, and they're based primarily on interviews and media article content analysis. And the 4th is actually looking at environmental determinants and its mapping of leopard killing locations, and then mapping environmental characteristics in the area to see if some of these characteristics play a role in where killings take place. So let's start with the first analysis. So the Kenyan interviews. So in April and May 2006, I went ahead and collaborated with the School for Field Studies and conducted 234 interviews in the Tsavo-Amboseli ecosystem. So this is the area between Amboseli and Tsavo West National Parks. It's a dispersal area for a lot of wildlife in the parks. So there's a lot of migration of wildlife in and out of the parks, so a lot of conflicts in these areas. So I did door-to-door interviews with translators, actually did cluster sampling and picked 4 sites, 2 sites that were close to conservation initiatives, 2 that were far away. And I talked about different questions that I had about human-wildlife conflict, relationship to wildlife, and beliefs about conservation, and spent about, I'd say, 20 minutes with each family at each of these locations, so that I talked to quite a lot of people. So the first main finding is that all residents live with the risk of human-wildlife conflict. And that doesn't look like much on paper. I think when we kind of think about it, we think of it from a very Western perspective. And actually, Mike pointed out an op-ed in the New York Times to me recently that's called In Zimbabwe, We Don't Cry for Lions. And it's written by a doctoral student at Wake Forest University who's from Zimbabwe, and was trying to explain that after this whole uproar from Cecil the lion that was killed, that people in Zimbabwe are confused and frustrated with the Western reaction, because living with lions, it's not really what we think about. Like, we see it behind glass, the zoo looks pretty, looks cute, it's adorable. It's not adorable when you're living next door to it, and when you walk out your front door, you don't know whether you're going to get eaten. And there's a video that I've been looking at actually from northeast of Mumbai, a town called Mulund. And in that video, you see a leopard, it's broad daylight, walks into the lobby of a really nice apartment building and just cruises in. And all of a sudden you see this scuffle on the side of the screen. And you see maybe 30 seconds later, leopard walks off with carcass of a dog. Broad daylight, middle of the day. So you have to think about human-wildlife conflict. Come on in, just in the back, go ahead. So you have to think about human-wildlife conflict in a different way, not the way that we think about it, but the way that it means when you walk out your door and you're not sure whether or not you're going to have a conflict and you're going to make it out alive. The other thing you have to think about in these areas is there really is no economic cushion. When you consider that, for example, in Tanzania, just across the border from Amboseli, the average loss of livestock due to leopards and other carnivores in that area is about 2/3 of the annual income per family. So imagine that at any one time you could lose 2/3 of your income, probably in a couple of incidents, and you have no way to make that up. So there are real costs to wildlife, and I don't know whether we really think of it that way coming from a Western kind of perspective. So in this area, 66% of people really believe that human-wildlife conflict was the biggest challenge to conservation. And they didn't always express it that directly, but what they complained about was these resource shortages and fighting for resources with wildlife they were struggling with on a daily basis. And that really didn't make them want to conserve wildlife in any way. The other challenges they cited with things like corruption, lack of knowledge about the importance of keeping an ecosystem healthy and having wildlife, and insufficient funding for a lot of conservation initiatives that got started but never continued. Just to kind of emphasize costs a little bit. So what people came up with in terms of when you asked them what the cost of living with wildlife was, is 72% of them said they saw absolutely no benefit from wildlife. And you got to remember that the average person, for example, in Kenya will never go to a national park to see wildlife. This is tourist attraction, not something that local people do. So 87% of them had wildlife destroy either crops, livestock, property, people, and most of them saw no compensation for any of those losses. And if they did see compensation, it was so haphazard that you could never bank on it. The only benefits they did see from wildlife is potentially employment if they were employed at one of these parks, or bursaries, so funds for education for their children. I think one of the main things, though, that came out of talking with these people is that there was such a resentment and distrust of government actors in this area. I mean, you would not believe the cursing that went on of just the people are so resentful because there's a history in this area where you have, the government creates a game reserve, for example, and we're going to see some revenue from tourism. And then for Amboseli, for example, they created it. Then a few years later, they gave it to the local people to manage and benefit from the resources and the income. But then when it got good, when things really started to make a profit, they took it back and said, oh, we're sorry, but we want this back and we're not letting you use the resources in the park anymore. So not only are you losing the income from the tourism, but you're also losing the access to all those lands that you used to graze your cattle on. So there's a lot of resentment, and that you actually see in a lot of the areas. So it's not surprising, given that 74% of people would not support conservation unless they saw some economic benefit from it. And what is interesting, though, is you would think that in Kenya, where there's such resentment of government, but also resentment of wildlife, that the instinct would be to kill. I mean, if you kill the wildlife, you get rid of the problem. I mean, logically, you don't actually in reality, but yes, it seems like that would work. But no, not that many people brought that up. Partly it's cultural. I mean, a lot of the tribes that live in this area, the Maasai, are very environmentally friendly. But only 5% of people actually brought up killing problem animals, even though it is a recognized method in that area. It's legal to cull with a permit, so it is something that's recognized, but people don't bring that up. What they do want is fencing of wildlife. And that has some conservation value. It is possible to fence certain areas to protect from human-wildlife conflict. So they're actually coming up with ideas that are fairly good. But it's interesting that they don't go to killing immediately. The last part of this analysis was a logistic regression that I ran to see what affected people's attitudes towards conservation. And really the only thing that came up significant, which is fairly obvious, I think, is the costs from wildlife made. The more costs you see, the less you're willing to support conservation. The more benefit you see, the more likely you are to support conservation, but also the more education you have, the more likely you are to support conservation. And there's actually, primary education is fairly common in this area, so there's quite a base to actually work with if you wanted to educate people to support conservation. So the second analysis was a set of South African interviews that I did in July and August 2011. 16 in-depth interviews. I call them in-depth because I usually spent about 1 to 3 hours with the people that I talked with and went over a lot of different topics, but I focused most of the questions I asked on leopard poaching in the region. And this was in the Heidelberg area of the Western Cape province, which is kind of a rural area where there's mostly livestock and some crop farming. It's a snowball sample in these areas. If you don't have somebody vouching for you, there's no way anybody will talk to you. And it was interesting because I got quite a range of people to talk to me in terms of attitudes towards conservation and what they did for a living. And I had a lot of people screaming at me over the phone being like, we don't like the conservation organization that recommended you, but we will talk to you because we want you to hear what we have to say. So this is the area. The little balloon there tells you where it is. So in South Africa, killings of leopards are usually in response to livestock predation. And what's interesting is that the community members actually have a way of dealing with problem leopards. They have their own little method. They have one farmer who has a set of leopard hunting dogs, And anytime somebody has a problem on their farm, they give the farmer a call and they say, come hunt on my land. We'll throw a barbecue. We'll, get rid of the leopard. And they won't call the authorities. There is an option to call, but they will never do so. So when I talked with everyone, most of the people in the region were like, yeah, we have a lot of retaliatory killings. I can tell you exactly where they took place, exactly who did it, and when. But when I talked to any of the government personnel, it was never an issue. Hadn't had a single leopard killed in whenever. So the last thing that I also want to point out is that distrust and anger among actors is really very strong. You have general distrust and anger from kind of historical underpinnings in the region, which is that farming is not subsidized in the area. And there's a lot of giving away of land to what white farmers called inexperienced black farmers, where the government is giving land to people to farm, but not giving them the resources to actually succeed. So you see a lot of farms failing. So there's a general kind of resentment of the government for some of these actions that they're taking and a lack of support. But there's also solution-specific distrust and anger, which is that a lot of conservation organizations are coming in and saying, I've got the solution for you. I know exactly how to deal with this problem. And coming in and really coming up with solutions that make no sense or are too hard to implement or, that don't end up working. So people have a lot of resentment. The farmers especially feel it. Every time somebody comes in, they're like, okay, I don't think I trust you and I'm not sure I'm actually going to use this. And this distrust that you see, actually, it makes it impossible for people to see, how much common ground they actually have. Because when I talked with the farmers and the government and NPO personnel, there was actually a lot of common ground. Just nobody was willing to admit that. Couldn't possibly agree with the other side. But there's a lot of common ground. And the first is that the response to human-leopard conflict in the area has failed. There's no other way to think about it. It's failed, and it's failed for 4 main reasons, which is methods that just don't work, laws that are really inadequate to deal with the problem, and not enough resources to deal with this. And also just a response that's been kind of slow and unwilling, almost like 2 steps backwards, 1 step forward. So I'll give you a few examples. For example, a lot of farmers complain that the methods used to deal with these leopards are usually not good. Like trapping cages are too small, leopards get out before you can actually move them. Government and NPO personnel recognizes that a lot of the solutions they're using are kind of one size fits all, and they're not working. And the one thing that I thought was nice was that, government and NPO personnel actually recognize that prevention measures that they're offering are burdensome. Like I'll give you an example. Bell collars are used in the area. It's literally a collar with a bell. You put it on your livestock, and then you have to take it on and off because it's supposed to scare the leopard. But if you keep it on your livestock constantly, eventually the leopard gets used to it and thinks, all right, it's no problem. So you have to take them on and off. But in South Africa, the way that farmers work is they leave their livestock to graze for 3 or 4 days in a kind of a remote area, and they only check on them maybe once a week. And so you can't do that. So these methods are just very difficult to implement. The laws are generally inadequate because they're not applied properly, and also because there's no national legislation, so every province is different. There's not enough resources generally. Farmers complain because they don't get any compensation, but that's because there's no money in actually trying to make these efforts work. And then just a lot of issues with corruption in the area and actually, coming to the rescue. There really isn't much willingness to come and help. So again, in terms of predation prevention methods, how you can prevent these conflicts with leopards, they agreed on a lot of stuff. I mean, there is some disagreement, but it's interesting. For example, with translocation, it doesn't work. The farmers think it doesn't work. The government actually doesn't think it works either. And although they express it differently, they actually agree. So farmers say that leopards come back. So you've translocated your leopard, you moved it from the farmer, it was a problem, put it somewhere else, and hopefully somewhere that's more wild, and it comes back to your farm. Well, the government and NPO recognizes that, they just don't say it the same way. They say that inter-leopard conflict is a problem. So what they mean is that when you deposit that leopard in another area, there's probably a leopard already living there, which is going to say, get out, this isn't your territory. So the conflict that creates ends up pushing the leopard that you translocated back to its original territory because there's nowhere else to go. So killing problem leopards both recognize that, it's an option, but it's just a question of when you do it. Trap and release. I love the government's response on this. They think it works, but they're just crossing their fingers that the leopard never comes back. And they admit it. So what's interesting with farmers, though, is that they actually come up with some pretty creative options. You got to give them credit. Some of them are not necessarily going to work, but they really do try. One of the things that I think will work is leopard-friendly products. If you think of the organic label here in the United States, well, in South Africa, you could create a leopard-friendly product label for farms, livestock farms that use leopard-friendly predation prevention methods. So if your farm is willing to make sure that you don't kill any leopards while you're raising your livestock, let's give you a label. And there's actually quite a market for luxury and natural products in South Africa. So really, it's possible that these farmers could make a large profit margin from that. So there's these solutions that they come up with that are actually pretty good. And I think one of the options that both recognize as actually a pretty good option is donkeys. This seems unusual, I think, to most people, but donkeys actually can kill a leopard by simply kicking it in the head. And a donkey, if you put it with a herd of cattle and it actually bonds with the cattle, it will defend those cattle, almost kill itself in doing so. But it depends on whether it bonds with the herd. So this is where the idea that any method isn't 100% effective comes in. That one farmer told me he had 4 donkeys. He put them in his herd, and 2 of them bonded and 2 of them didn't. So the reality is you have to keep checking and make sure that these things work. But it is an option, and a very cheap option at that. Donkeys are remarkably cheap in South Africa for some reason. Apparently they're not very well loved. So in India, you see a different picture. In India, you actually have mostly leopard attacks on humans. You see leopard attack on livestock as well, but it's mostly, large part is leopard attack on humans. And it's a historical trend. This is data from the University of Chicago, but it's actually British government data originally from when India was still a British colony. It shows you that you had a certain amount of people killed by leopards in all the different provinces. And that for some provinces, it's actually been increasing. And if you look at more recent government data and Forest Department data, you still see that in a lot of these kind of Indian states that people are attacked on a regular basis. But actually, I do want to put this in perspective. We talk about human-leopard conflict because that's my topic, but there are 5 million people a year that are bitten by snakes, and 94,000 of them die, mostly in developing countries. So human-wildlife conflict isn't just about leopards, it's about a lot of different animals. So for India, I used Google Alert articles, which is a very kind of unusual source of data, and it was not really by choice, it was really because it was almost impossible to get data for India, and I didn't get the chance to go out there myself. But when you don't have access to a lot of data, you got to get creative and flexible, and so this is what I found. So Google Alerts, you enter a keyword into Google and you tell it to basically send you results every week. I focused on media articles, and I asked for results for India and for the year 2012. And Google filters using a PageRank algorithm. So essentially, it filters your results by the frequency and location of the keywords on the page, the age of the web page, and how many links you have to that web page. So the problem with that is it does lead to some kind of Western world source bias, because a lot of Western pages tend to have more links to them, or also older. But actually, most of the articles that I ended up using for my content analysis were really from Indian sources, local Indian newspapers. And the other problem with media kind of data is that you get sensational case bias. And obviously, leopard attacks on humans, sensational. So you wonder if you really get a good representation of cases of what leopard attacks on humans mean. And looking at the literature, the research literature, and kind of the nonprofit literature as well, the gray literature, even with sensational case bias, I still did see a good representation of all the different kind of types of killings that you see. So based on this content analysis, I found that in India, humans are attacked throughout their daily activities. I mean, you're talking inside houses, less than 50 meters from houses, really every point in your day, you have a chance of being attacked, which is kind of scary. And obviously it triggers panic in these areas. Anytime you see a leopard, people panic. And then the panic turns to anger because they feel so helpless in the face of trying to deal with these issues. And the anger really is at the ineffective government response, which is oftentimes no action at all. And also because people feel that the government is responsible for dealing with these animals. The government owns these animals. You cannot hunt animals in India without a permit. And without a permit, meaning you can only get a permit if the animal is either causing serious bodily harm to someone or if it's too diseased to really recover. So people feel like the government is prioritizing the animal's welfare instead of theirs. And that anger is compounded by a culture of denial and of blaming of people who get attacked. There's actually quotes from Forest Department officials saying that people get attacked because they're being casual about living with leopards. It's like, how casual can you get? So, there's all this anger, and I would say that it's actually quite strong and stronger than in Kenya and South Africa, where people actually will attack Forest Department officials. There are a couple cases where people, like mobs, will literally beat up Forest Department officials that come to deal with problem leopards. They'll usually kill the leopard in the process. One article talked about a group of villagers that actually kidnapped some of the Forest Department officials and poured kerosene over them, telling them that they didn't kill the leopard in the area that was attacking humans, that they would set them on fire. So it gets pretty severe. And that hasn't been seen in the other two areas that I look at. So again, everybody agrees that the response has failed. And it's slightly different reasons in India. My favorite is passing the buck. Basically, every Forest Department official usually either delegates the task of dealing with human-leopard conflict or, misplaces the file, the complaint, or, decides that they're not going to respond, which is pretty common. And when they do respond, there's a lot of poor investigations of retaliatory leopard killings that make a prosecution for it completely impossible, basically. And even when Forest Department officials do respond to a problem with a leopard, they make so many mistakes that there's no trust that they will actually resolve the problem. A lot of cases happen in India where they're thinking about translocating a leopard and they have to tranquilize that leopard to get it into a cage and move it. And they overdose the leopard on tranquilizers, so the leopard dies. And it's pretty common. So this anger that you see in these areas of this failure kind of drives the response of the Forest Department usually to really negative ways. And one of them is that they end up disobeying the law. You cannot kill a leopard in India without a permit from the chief wildlife warden. Well, most departments don't even bother getting one. So clearly nobody's paying attention to what you're supposed to do, and there's a lot of confusion over what the best practices are. Everybody talks about the need to, kill man-eaters. This is a big term in India. Leopards that consistently attack humans. But nobody can identify what a man-eater is. They have no idea of how to figure out which leopard is the man-eater. And so you end up killing ones that probably didn't need to be killed to begin with, if they needed to be killed at all. So from this content analysis, I came up with a number of kind of responses that were suggested by either the media or the people they interviewed. And some of them, like translocation and killing leopards, and trying to identify them with camera traps, are not really particularly effective and I don't think are really worth discussing. But what is worth discussing are a couple other ones. The first, I think, is the idea of floodlights near schools. There's a lot of attacks of children by leopards in India. One of the ways to scare away a leopard is to use bright lights. So you can put in floodlights near schools to kind of, as soon as you see movement in an area near the school, to kind of have light there to help prevent leopard attacks. One of the more funnier ones with relocating villagers, and I think this is funny mostly because, how far can you relocate people? Eventually you're going to run out of space, and we're not quite there. For some people haven't realized that yet. The other thing that I think is interesting is awareness programs. So when you have a leopard sighting that triggers panic, you want to actually respond by giving people the tools to come up with solutions. And part of that is also just coming into communities that have, had problems with leopards in the past and say, okay, let me teach you some skills to cohabit peacefully or as peaceful as possible. So let me teach you some better methods to kind of keep your livestock safe. Let me teach you what to do when you see a leopard. And those things actually help reduce some of the anger and the fear that triggers a lot of these retaliatory killings of leopards. So last part of my research is looking at the locations of retaliatory leopard killings and then looking at the environmental characteristics in those areas and trying to figure out if any particular environmental characteristics contribute to where leopards are killed. So the study area for this was actually the Eastern and Western Cape provinces of South Africa, the areas around these reserves. And what I did was I separated my study areas into grid cells. And for each grid cell, I mapped environmental variables, and I'll show you those in a second. And then I used a case control design where I did a number of grid cells that were controls. So they were either grid cells that were adjacent to where a killing took place, or grid cells within a 40-kilometer square buffer. So the second column gives you some of the independent variables that I looked at. So I looked at human settlement, protected areas, the type of vegetation in the area, whether or not there were a lot of roads, so the mileage of roads in a particular grid cell, same thing with rivers. I also looked at prey availability and prey abundance, and also the season, because attacks are seasonal based on resource shortages. So just to give you an idea of how some of these variables fit in, for example, the less prey available, the more likely you are to see usually livestock getting eaten and therefore retaliatory leopard killing. Just one example. So sadly, this was the analysis that I had the most hope in. And because the data had a certain amount of issues, I think that, and I had a small sample size, it wasn't as spectacular as I had hoped, but there are still some things to be taken from it. The only variable that actually came out significant was the amount of main roads in a grid cell. So cells where you didn't have a leopard killing actually had more roads than cells where you had a killing. So in my mind, I think of it as, I would think that killings would take place where it's easiest to kill leopards, which means that you can get there easily with transportation. I mean, when I say there's no roads, like you're talking bush with trees and like rocks and you can't get a car through. So I would assume that you would actually see more killings where it's possible to get close to a leopard. But actually, this makes sense that you would actually see more killings in areas where there are no roads, because most leopards, according to the literature, will never cross a road that is 2 lanes or more. So basically your typical road, leopards don't cross them. So they actually are more abundant in areas where there really are no roads. So therefore they're more likely to be killed there. So when you think about responses, what do? Well, I think a couple of things have come out from what I've done is that, any solution should be multi-pronged and interdisciplinary, mostly because a lot of disciplines have a lot to bring to the table for this. Biology, anthropology, a lot of conflict resolution techniques are very useful, and multi-pronged because no one solution is 100% effective. And I think that's something that farmers really are butting their heads against, that they want this one solution that's going to work and that, it's going to solve all their problems. It's never going to happen. The reality is, wildlife's too unpredictable, the environment's too unpredictable, humans are too unpredictable. So you need a multi-solution, what I call a toolkit. They need to be self-sustaining because most of the solutions, since we're seeing increases in human-wildlife conflict, they're going to need to be implemented long-term. And that doesn't happen if you don't have funding available. And they have to be led by local residents, mostly because they're the ones that are going to implement this. Most conservation organizations come in, they've got a budget, they've got a time frame, and then they walk out again. And that doesn't work. So you need local residents to kind of spearhead these things, but also with outside input, because you need the knowledge of researchers to come in. And you need to do very specific solutions for very specific locations, because no one solution will fit everywhere. So I think of it as, I think of using 2 frameworks to essentially build what I call a human-leopard conflict toolkit. The first is participatory crime analysis. And the idea behind this is to actually kind of harness local knowledge and then use a collaborative process with researchers to kind of come up with solutions that work based on this local knowledge. So usually in a participatory crime analysis workshop, you kind of teach people about crime prevention, then you have them essentially identify places where crime is common, and then go ahead and map that, put all these areas together, go visit these areas, talk with these community members about what the issues are, and then come up with responses together. So that's the idea that you want to use here to come up with solutions. And then you also want to use the 25 techniques of situational crime prevention. I think it gives a really great framework for kind of coming up with a number of solutions to the problem that can work together. So just the 25 techniques of situational crime prevention. You can reduce crime by increasing the effort to commit it, increasing the risks, reducing the rewards, reducing provocations for crime, and removing the excuses. And I'll go through and give you an example of like how you can use this with some solutions for human-leopard conflict and retaliatory leopard killings. So for example, you can use bell collars in Kenya, because in Kenya, the practice is that shepherds stay with their flock all the time, or almost all the time. So they have the ability to come in and take off some of the bell collars on a regular basis. But in South Africa, you wouldn't use that. Farmers are just not going to make it work. But I think in South Africa, you could keep birthing livestock indoors. This is what one farmer suggested, actually, that when livestock is actually about to give birth, what happens is they walk away from the herd to give birth. And at that point, they're much more at risk of being attacked because they're away from the herd, they're easy pickings. So the idea that you can try that in South Africa. In Kenya, for example, you can also use game scouts. They actually use this with lions. They train community members to track lions. And anytime that a lion is getting close to a community, they warn the community, help them build stronger enclosures for the livestock. And they actually also perform a public service. So if somebody loses a head of livestock because it wandered away, they will recover the animal for them. So they build a connection with the community and then come up with solutions for them to not have their livestock eaten by lions. So there's some ideas in different places. In India, one of the things that was mentioned in one of the articles was the idea of kind of getting local school children and local villagers involved by having them adopt a local leopard. I mean, there's research that shows that you have leopards literally visiting the same house every night in India and never actually causing a conflict. They will literally, you'll have the inhabitants of the house a lot of times sleeping outside or with the windows open, and a leopard will stay right past every night, never a problem. So if you can create the sense of ownership with local community members of leopards, that maybe they can track that leopard, during the science curriculum and kind of understand its habits and understand how to react when you see one, you can build willingness to actually prevent leopard killings. Another thing you could do is reduce provocations. I think of tick fever prevention efforts in South Africa, because a lot of livestock farmers lose about 30% of their herd to tick fever. And they're okay with that. That's what's scary. They're okay with that, but they're not okay with one loss from leopards. But what if you could reduce that 30% to, let's say, 10%? Maybe they'd be more willing to at least accept another loss from a leopard. So things like this. You could also adjust incentives, things like providing alternative benefits from wildlife, like bursaries that you see in Kenya, or tourism revenue sharing. To give you an idea, Amboseli National Park, at the time that I actually did my interviews, brought in $3.4 billion a year. 2% of that went back to the communities. So some limitations. Unfortunately, as I said, the data wasn't great, but what's interesting is you can still come up with some very results that come across for every study area that are the same. Translation, when you do interviews, obviously there could be some error that was introduced there depending on how well the translators translated what was said. Snowball sampling is really not ideal, but like I said, in these communities, it has a lot of added benefits that people open up to you if you actually are referred by another community member. Small sample sizes. I do have 2 studies where, sample size is 16 for interviews, and another where the cases of actual leopard killings is 13 cases. Small sample size is an issue, but as I said, with multiple analyses and seeing that you can replicate these results across analyses, that definitely bolsters the results that I have found. The media bias from Western world sources and also just sensational cases. I think the biggest limitation, though, is observed versus unobserved leopard killings. This idea that, with crime, you always have a dark figure. But with retaliatory leopard killings, the dark figure is even bigger, because you don't have the result of the crime, I guess, is how I think about it. When somebody kills a leopard in retaliation for livestock losses, they kill the leopard and then they dump the carcass in the bush. Within 48 hours, it's gone. Scavengers, whatever else. The point is that they're trying to get rid of the evidence. So I think you have a lot of unobserved cases, especially because in the areas where these things happen, there's really very little law enforcement presence. So really nobody's detecting these killings. But what's interesting is I use data from the Landmark Foundation on retaliatory leopard killings. And that foundation is actually embedded in the local community where it works. It only hires locals. And they collar every single leopard in the study area. And they know when a leopard disappears, because if the leopard's collared, if your collar all of a sudden disappears or stop moving, you can go find that collar, or you know that the leopard probably has been killed and the collar destroyed. So I'm pretty confident that a lot of the cases that occurred in this area, especially because the community is so close-knit, that we had some record of it. And then for my last analysis, a lot of data is open source. And that means that I can't pick the dates that a lot of times the dates don't match up. I did my best to come up with dates, data from dates that actually did overlap with my dependent variable. But there is still some, there may be some issues as a result of that. The two variables where I think it would be most problematic are human settlement and prey availability. And actually the direction of how those two variables really are going to change over time, I know, is that human settlement increases over time and prey abundance usually decreases as a result. So if anything in this analysis, those two variables are underestimated. Finally, contributions to theory and practice. I think that environmental criminology actually has a lot to contribute to understanding retaliatory leopard killings, but just generally illegal killings of wildlife in general. It gives a great framework for kind of thinking about the problem and coming up with solutions as well. I think that if anything, I've proved that even with limited data, you can come up with some pretty consistent results and some pretty interesting results, actually. And I think the two things in practice that I really found was that when you think about illegal killings and you think about retaliatory killings versus poaching, and we always focus on one versus the other, they actually have a common precursor. And so you don't need to deal with them separately. You can deal with them together and actually almost kill two birds with one stone. And I think there are a lot of different points in this interaction between humans and wildlife where you can actually prevent wildlife killings. So it's just a question of understanding that process and at which points you actually can act. And future research, I've thought a little bit about this, but I have to say I'm a little bit tired at this point, so it will be for later. But crowdsourcing for data collection. One of the things that always amused me and amazed me in Kenya was that everybody has a cell phone. You can talk with the Maasai warrior who lives in a mud hut, no electricity. He has the latest iPhone, and I'm not kidding. And so, I've been thinking about developing an app in collaboration with some computer scientists that people can essentially report a human-wildlife conflict. 3 simple questions like, where did the conflict take place? What sort of conflict is it? Maybe another question about, how they resolved it, and have them either take a picture or just GPS at a GPS location, which the phone can do by itself. And you can collect data that way. People are always on their cell phones all around the world. And I want to use agent-based modeling to kind of redo my last analysis of environmental kind of characteristics. I think, I need more sophisticated methods, and agent-based modeling is something that I can definitely use to move forward. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Your color